Thank you, Kirsty. And my sincere thanks to the organisers for inviting me to participate in this very intense weekend of focus on the Great War, which ironically is taking place in a state that was not a belligerent during the conflict. This is my first time in Oslo. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really hope it won't be my last time. Now, what I'm not going to look at today is civilian understandings of courage, nor am I going to comment much on the way the military, especially the army as an institution, understood soldiers' courage. I'm going to focus much more on the way I believe, or I think the evidence suggests, that soldiers themselves understood their own courage, what courage in this radically new form of warfare was. Now, there's a tendency, a persistent tendency, I would say both academic and popular, to understand the soldiers of the First World War, those who fought and died on the Western Front and elsewhere, as victims. Now, on the one hand, this is a highly understandable view. We look back at the First World War, we understand something of the horror that men experienced, the death tolls, the enormous death tolls that were suffered on the battlefronts, and we've a tendency to say, well, what chance did they stand of survival? War, first and foremost, is a military endeavor, and the essence of that endeavor is killing. And between 1914 and 1918, killing took place on a vast, completely unprecedented scale. So we've an understandable tendency to understand the men who fought and died in this conflict as victims, victims of something, victims of industrialized warfare. Not faceless victims, perhaps, not passive victims, but victims nonetheless. Now, one thing I want to strongly argue this afternoon is that however we understand it today in the 21st century, this is emphatically not how soldiers understood themselves during the Great War. Now, most of what I say will have a particular relevance to British soldiers, but my research, tentatively at least at this stage, suggests that there was similar cultures in the armies of France, Germany, and Italy as well. Now, courage changes over time. Courage in warfare changes from conflict to conflict. In peacetime, notions of courage change. The courage of the 20th century is very different to the courage of the previous century. But one thing that's strikingly consistent about people's understandings of courage over time is that courage is invariably related to fear, and cowardice is too. So a useful definition of courage is the ability to control fear, to master fear. And I think that manifests itself, that turns out in quite interesting ways over the course of the First World War. So fear, the mastery of fear, the ability to control fear, is a good basic definition of courage. Now, this gentleman here was a French strategist, French staff officer in the years before the Great War. He was one of the great military thinkers in Europe in the decades before 1914. He was a Général de Brigade in the French army. He's an interesting figure. His stuff is worth reading. In a typically French way, he wasn't just a military strategist, he was something of a philosopher as well, which is very much not the tendency with British staff officers of this period. Writing in 1911, Jean Collin identified fear and the mastery of fear in the individual soldier as the decisive factors in modern warfare. He agreed with other commentators who argued that the huge advances in weapons technology that had taken place in the 30 or so years before 1914 had radically changed the face of warfare. So the advent of smokeless gunpowder, combined with the increased efficiency and range of small arms and artillery, had fundamentally changed the face of war. Now, it's useful in this sense to compare 1914 with 1815 and the Napoleonic Wars. So the standard weapon of the First World War infantryman is a bolt-action rifle. His ancestor, a century previously, had a musket, a flintlock musket. Now, a good musketeer could fire maybe 2 rounds a minute, 2 fairly inaccurate rounds a minute. A good rifleman during the First World War could fire perhaps 15 rounds a minute. Now, the Lee Enfield, which was the rifle that British soldiers used, was very efficient, but most armies had some form of this highly efficient bolt-action rifle. The Maxim machine gun, extraordinarily powerful compared to weapons that existed in conflicts before the Great War, and it changed the face of warfare to a degree. But the key weapon that shapes, defines the experience of the war, especially on the Western Front, but also on the Eastern Front and Gallipoli and elsewhere too, is the artillery piece. So artillery guns, cannons of the Great War were much more efficient and, importantly, much more accurate than they had been in the 19th century. So according to Jean Collin, soldiers, and he's writing in 1911 here, soldiers fighting in future conflicts would be forced to advance over extended open ground toward a relatively distant, relatively invisible enemy. In such conditions, he argued, attacking a well-defended position would be an acutely terrifying experience for the average infantryman. And conventional frontal assaults would be doomed to failure unless fear could be controlled. So success in the battlefield for Collin, and there's others who see it this way too, would belong to the army that recognized and learned to control what he referred to as moral factors. Now, the most important of these moral factors for Collin was fear. So he went on to list a series of remedies for fear that junior officers could employ on the battlefield. So, as the fear that gripped soldiers while they prepared for combat was usually inspired by a sense of the unknown, an impending sense of uncertainty and doom, and the fear that they might be killed, officers should set an example of calm and put men at their ease by treating an engagement with the enemy as if it were something expected and normal. Now, of course, that puts enormous pressure on junior officers. Collin also argued that because physical and mental immobility could have a debilitating effect on the individual soldier, it was crucial to keep men as active and mobile as possible in the front line. Now, the book in which these observations appeared, Les Transformations de Guerre, was translated into English in 1912 and disseminated in British military circles. This is very common during this period. The leaders in publications on military strategy, the Germans and the French, their works were translated and they were consumed in Britain to a degree. Now, Collin's work actually reveals a remarkably firm grasp on the impact that advances in weapons technology were likely to have on the experience of battle. Now, we tend to have this sense today that people before 1914 really had no idea. They didn't anticipate the reality of the Great War in any realistic sense at all. But some of what was written before 1914 was remarkably prescient. It was remarkably accurate in what it predicted would happen. What Collin did not anticipate, what he could not have anticipated, was that the war on the Western Front, precisely because of these pre-war advances, would quickly descend into an attritional trench war. Although he accurately predicted the preponderance of the defensive, moreover, he did not foresee the degree to which artillery would dominate the battlefield. Now, as a very diverse range of military historians has been at pains to point out, the war on the Western Front between 14 and 18 was first and foremost an artillery war. So if we want to understand the ways in which frontline soldiers understood courage, we must therefore consider what the experience of frontline service in such a war was like. Short-range shelling, trench mortars, sniping, this sort of thing, all of these were, exposure to that sort of fire was pretty terrifying in itself. But with experience, junior officers and men tended to, learn to get used to this routine fire that they would experience in ordinary trench warfare. But coming under intense, concentrated shell fire, particularly of the sort laid down by large caliber heavy artillery, was quite a different experience. The personal narratives produced by soldiers during the war bear witness to the abject terror they felt when they were forced to withstand heavy artillery bombardment. And what's striking about this is that it exists in all personal narrative accounts, diaries, correspondence, the memoirs that are produced after the war. This abject terror, this sense of helplessness, this loss of control that men experienced under heavy artillery bombardment. One of the more striking descriptions of this comes from a German author, Ernst Junger. His book is on sale here, actually, in Norwegian in the bookshop. So he wrote this Very interesting, very kind of engrossing, very striking memoir of his experiences in Stahlgewittern, which got translated into English in 1929 as In Storm of Steel. But this is what he had to say about the experience of heavy shell fire. I believe I have found a comparison that exactly conveys what I, in common with all the rest who went through the war, experienced in situations such as this. It is as if one were tied to a post and threatened by a fellow swinging a sledgehammer. Now the hammer is swung back for the blow, now it whirls forward, till, just missing your skull, it sends splinters flying from the post once more. That is exactly what it feels like to be exposed to heavy shelling without cover. So what Junger is alluding to here is this acute sense of disempowerment, loss of agency, sense that you have no control, that you're at the whim of enemy bombardment. Now, among his remedies for fear, Colin had suggested that men should be kept mobile in order to counteract the sense of terror and helplessness engendered by powerful enemy fire. But of course, men cowering in a trench or in a shell hole during a bombardment were completely denied the relief of mobility. They couldn't move. That was the defining experience. And even in periods of relative quiet, life in the trenches, at least during the daytime, was characterized by a general lack of movement and activity. So men very often sat around in a state of inaction and had no sense that they were fighting the enemy or doing anything to affect the outcome of the war. Now, it's different for artillery gunners. They have some sense that they're fighting back, but of course they're at a remove from the enemy that they're fighting against, and they tend to write of a sense of alienation and detachment from the killing at the front. Now, Jean Collin had also advised that when within range of enemy guns, soldiers should be allowed to use their weapons as freely as possible. Now, in theory, allowing a man to fire his rifle at will would give him the potentially empowering feeling that he was fighting back by returning fire. But again, this was a remedy that was denied to men in the midst of an enemy bombardment whose weapons, the bolt-action rifle, were patently useless in the face of artillery. This was an enemy that the infantryman simply could not fight. His only course of action was to endure the bombardment and hope that his own artillery would retaliate. Roland Fielding, who was an English officer who commanded an Irish regiment, the 6th Connacht Rangers, was quite struck by the sheer helplessness of infantrymen when confronted with the awesome power of artillery. And he wrote this to his wife in February 1917, after about 2 years at the front. This is after a particularly gruesome encounter with heavy artillery in the front line. Through it all they stand, frozen and half paralyzed by the cold and wet, with no individual power of retaliation beyond the rifle which each man carries, and which is about as much use against the weapons by which he is tormented as a popgun. So the rifle was useless in the face of the artillery piece. So his inability to retaliate, combined with the indiscriminate, seemingly capricious nature of the destruction wreaked by artillery, meant that a man's individual attributes appeared to count for very little in the front line. So the strongest, fittest, most well-trained individual in a regiment or whatever the unit at the front was just as vulnerable as his weakest comrade. And understanding that is crucial to understanding the frontline experience on the Western Front. So for millennia, for thousands of years before 1914, arguably, a man, a warrior, could go into battle and he could say to himself, I'm well trained, I'm physically fit, I'm courageous, I know my weapon, I trust my comrades, so I have a pretty good chance of surviving this. Now, that doesn't disappear completely during the war on the Western Front, but it's greatly reduced. The sense of personal agency, personal prowess is greatly reduced. So again, the strongest, bravest, most experienced man in the frontline unit was just as vulnerable to the threat of death or serious injury as his weakest comrade, his weakest, most inexperienced comrade. Now, revisionist military historians, the so-called revisionist military historians, have rightly pointed out that life in the front line, or life at the front, was not relentlessly grim. That infantrymen spent most of their time in sections of the front that were either relatively or completely free from enemy fire, and that boredom was arguably as much of a threat to troop morale as fear. When at rest, however, soldiers knew that it was only a matter of time before they returned to the danger, violence, and discomfort of the trenches. So it wasn't simply the experience of coming under enemy fire that tested men's courage and endurance, but the knowledge that that experience would be repeated. So a man might spend over the course of 2 years or 3 years, only a minority of this time actually in the front line and under fire. But throughout the entirety of that experience, he knew that sooner or later he was going back to the trenches. So it's always hanging over. Okay, so that has an acute impact on his power of endurance and his will to carry on. Soldiers serving in or near the front line in France or Belgium often lived under the threat of death or serious injury for weeks or months on end. And although the cycle of violence experienced by individual soldiers was punctuated by periods of rest, it was nonetheless a cycle. In the words of Lord Moran, who, as Charles McMorran Wilson, served as a medical officer on the front line and later wrote the classic Anatomy of Courage, fear in this war was, quote, no longer an occasional, an exotic visitor, but a permanent settler in our midst. Fear was always there. So fear was always present to some degree, whether men were in or out of the line. So in this sense, the war on the Western Front took on the characteristics of siege warfare. Siege warfare, however, in which the individual prowess or agency of the frontline infantryman was reduced almost to nil. So while many officers and men coped well with frontline service, at least to begin with, and some clearly really enjoyed the experience, a stage was inevitably reached after an extended period of service when resilience began to wane or broke altogether. And you notice this when you read diaries produced by men who served at the front that cover a period of a year or 18 months or even 2 years. You'll notice a change in mood, a change in language over the course of that term of service. In April 1915, Lionel Crouch, a junior officer in the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, wrote of his first tour in the trenches. Now, this was a diary entry near enough to the beginning of the war, April 1915. This is what Lionel Crouch had to say. I have never enjoyed myself more than during the last 3 days. The guns are banging away again and bullets are zipping over the trench all the time. The more I see of this show, the more I want to see. So he's having a great time. He's really enjoying it. It's a very visceral experience. It's an exciting experience. It's very vivid. It's life-affirming almost in an ironic way. In a letter written to his mother in January 1916, so some 8 or 9 months later, the tone is markedly different. That's what he has to say then. I feel so beastly nervy now. I have taken to ducking at bullets, which I never used to do, and shells make me jump like blazes. We are all getting like that. It is absurd keeping us in the trenches so long, 6 months continuously now. Now, Lionel Crouch, his nerve had not broken, and he went on to serve with great distinction and gallantry until he was killed during the Somme offensive the following July. But his reserves of courage, his capital of courage, if you like, and that of his comrades, had clearly been depleted. Now, one of the frustrating things about studying courage, and indeed cowardice, during this period is that even though terms like valor and courage and gallantry are used all the time in the popular press, in the rhetoric of politicians, by soldiers themselves, very few people, very few commentators during the war actually sit down and try and analyze what they mean by this and try and elucidate, what is it we mean when we refer to someone as courageous or heroic. One very interesting exception was Lord Moran, who was known at the time as Charles McMorran Wilson. Now, he achieved a certain amount of fame later in his life when he was the personal physician of Winston Churchill during the Second World War. And his letters, his diaries, which contain quite a bit of controversial, sort of revelations about Churchill, were published after the war. But he's known to First World War historians primarily for his writing on courage. He qualified as a doctor just before the outbreak of the war in 1914, and before taking a civilian position anywhere, he gained a commission in the Royal Army Medical Corps. So he spent over 2 years on the Western Front with the Royal Fusiliers and had quite a tough experience. Now, naturally, as a medical officer, this was something that consumed his professional life, if you like, at the front. What enabled men either to withstand or to break down under fire, what caused them to break down or enabled them to withstand the stresses of service. He was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry himself during the Somme offensive in 1916. So, he had something of a first-hand experience of courage. He produced this classic memoir, which is still in print and well worth reading. But his great contribution to our understanding of courage, and he wasn't the first person to say it, but he's probably the person who put it in the most articulate terms. What he said was that courage is like capital. It's like money in the bank. And every man has a certain amount of it to begin with. But in warfare, and especially in long-haul warfare, the sort of war that was fought on the Western Front, at moments of stress, moments of terror, usually in heavy engagements with the enemy, either during battle or during bombardment, a man has to take serious withdrawals. Okay? And sooner or later, every man, no matter how rich he is in courage to begin with, reaches breaking point. He goes into deficit. And if artillery fire could greatly reduce a soldier's sense of personal agency, poison gas, the advent of which Colin and the other pre-war commentators did not predict, had the potential to destroy it completely. From a technical and tactical perspective, actually, armies learned to deal quite well with poison gas, with chemical warfare. And ultimately, poison gas claimed far fewer lives than rifle fire, machine gun fire, and certainly artillery fire. But it did have a debilitating psychological effect on soldiers in the front line, and medical officers noticed this in particular. A man called Charles Crutwell, who became a historian after the First World War and wrote some interesting stuff about the kind of political dynamics of the war, served as a junior officer in the Royal Berkshire Regiment on the Western Front. And he was in the trenches just south of Ypres in April 1915 when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas for the first time. This is during the Second Battle of Ypres. And his remarks on the weapon's power to extinguish men's individual feelings of prowess and control are very revealing indeed, I think. This is what he said. In the face of gas, without protection, individuality was annihilated. The soldier in the trench became a mere passive recipient of torture and death. A final stage seemed to be reached in the whole tendency of modern scientific warfare to depress and make of no effect individual bravery, enterprise, and skill. Again, nearly every soldier is or becomes a fatalist on active service. It quietens his nerve to believe his chance will be favorable, or the reverse. But his fatalism depends on the belief that he has a chance. If the very air which he breathes is poison, his chance is gone. He is merely a destined victim for the slaughter. Now, his reference at the end there to victimhood bears very directly indeed on the soldier's conception of courage during the First World War. We should remember that quite a number of the men who served in the front line in the various different armies actually had lots of opportunities to kill the enemy. So snipers, trench mortar operators, machine gunners, these people got the chance to strike at the enemy and had the feeling that they were at least doing something. Also, aggressive patrolling of no man's land, which was carried out increasingly from about 1915 onwards, mid-1915, offered men the chance to personally strike back at the enemy. Set-piece battles, big offensives, often involved a good deal of hand-to-hand killing as well, and probably more than historians have allowed for. And there is ample evidence that many, if not all soldiers, really relished the opportunity to engage with the enemy at close quarters, to get their hands on the enemy. The fact remains, however, that much of the day-to-day activity of the infantryman in the line was devoted not to killing, but to avoiding being killed. In a very real sense, then, the nature of the war on the Western Front tended to reduce the frontline soldier's status to that of victim, not perpetrator, of violence. Now, this is important. The degree to which soldiers either accepted or rejected that victimhood is the difference between courage and cowardice. So, victimhood and saying, I'm not a victim, or accepting that victimhood, that's crucial. Now, the British Army on the Western Front by 1916, by the time of the Somme offensive, is enormous. The French and German armies are enormous from the outset. And these armies are extremely diverse in regional, ethnic, religious, racial, and social terms. So historians really should avoid making gross generalizations about mentalities. So it's a mistake to say British soldiers felt this way, or British soldiers felt that way. A Welsh corporal is likely to respond very differently to his experiences than an English officer, or indeed an Indian officer, an Australian officer. Having said that, however, certain contemporary sources do give us an insight into the broad ethos of the infantry in the front line and shed light on the way the mass of ordinary soldiers, officers and men, understood courage and correct soldierly conduct. So there is a way in which we can get at trench culture and put to one side individual ideas and individual responses and try and understand what the culture of the front line was, what the ethos of frontline soldiers was, and especially the understanding of courage within that ethos. Now, I think trench journals are a particularly useful source in this regard. So trench journals were essentially amateur newspapers produced by soldiers during the war. Now, there's a sort of a tradition going back before the war of regimental journals, but trench journals have that distinct characteristic of usually being produced by men on active service for other men on active service. So they tell us a huge amount about mentalities, about the way men understood the war. Now, a lot of the content, actually, of these trench journals is quite serious. You know, there's high-minded poetry, there are tributes to dead comrades, that sort of thing. It's fairly serious stuff. But for the most part, the mood of the trench journals is relentlessly humorous. It's tongue-in-cheek. The pages of these journals are filled with mock advertisements, comic sketches, limericks, cartoons, and amusing short stories. This is especially true of journals like the Wipers Times, which were produced and edited actually in the front line. Now, the mordant worldview, the sarcastic, humorous worldview expressed in these sources, I think, sheds valuable light on the way frontline soldiers understood their own circumstances, the way they interpreted the war as they were fighting it. And it's more revealing, arguably, than the serious content. Now, a constant refrain in this humorous material is that while officers and men don't actually enjoy the experience of trench warfare, they are prepared to withstand it and make sacrifices as cheerfully as possible until the war is won. So although the deprivation, the violence, the danger of the front line are rarely denied in these trench newspapers, they are usually alluded to in a manner that suggests that frontline soldiers, fed up though they may be, can withstand them, they can endure them. Now, this resilient willingness to take whatever the war dished out was quite succinctly expressed in a piece of comic verse that appeared in the BEF Times, so the British Expeditionary Force Times, in February 1918. And this was actually a successor of the Wipers Times. Now, this isn't very elegant, but it's revealing, so I'm going to read it for you. What matter though the wily Hun, with bomb and gas and many a gun, in futile fury lashes out, don't worry what it's all about, stick it. Though shelled by day and bombed by night, a shirt though lively, dry delight, when halfway there you think your back must break, you're thirsty, grub you lack, stick it. As someone said, there's no road yet, but had an end, your grinder's set on this one thing, that if you grin and carry on, we're sure to win, stick it. Now this philosophy, this attitude of sticking it, also pervades soldier songs, another great indicator of troop sentiment. Now, as with the content of the trench newspapers, the songs that were composed and sung by soldiers during the war were very influenced by the Edwardian music hall and theatre review culture of pre-war Britain. Importantly, moreover, violence, or the violence depicted in soldier songs, is depicted in much the same mock heroic way as it is in the newspapers. The last two verses of a popular song called If the Sergeant Steals Your Rum provide a highly representative example. And although the lyrics are a bit more graphic than this, the theme is strikingly similar. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. Though the blasted sandbags fly, you have only once to die. If old Jerry shells the trench, never mind. If you get stuck on the wire, never mind. If you get stuck on the wire, never mind. Though the light's as broad as day, when you die they stop your pay. If you get stuck on the wire, never mind. Now, as with this more humorous trench journalism, the prospect of dying a horrible death is not denied, but presented as a trivial and rather comic fact of life. Now, in the 1930s, two veterans of the Great War, men who'd served as privates on the Western Front, one a New Zealander, the other an Englishman, John Brophy and Eric Partridge. They published this really fascinating lexicon of soldier songs and slang. And it influenced Oh, What a Lovely War, and it was reproduced in the 1960s. But for them, for these two guys who, remember, had served as privates themselves, for them, the chance to ridicule heroism, to ridicule all heroics in song, strengthened men's resolve to endure. So escapist lyrics were not symptoms of defeatism, but strong bulwarks against it. Now, Robert Graves, who's a memoirist, English man who served in a Welsh regiment, in his classic memoir, Goodbye to All That, he refers to Welsh soldiers singing defeatist songs. But George Orwell, who hadn't, of course, served in the war himself, he was a schoolboy during the war, writing about English identity or British identity in the 1930s, he referred to these songs more accurately as mock defeatist. Okay? So the point is that this isn't defeatism, it's actually resisting, it's rejecting defeatism. And the use of humour is absolutely crucial here. Now, British soldiers frequently wrote quite seriously and quite, darkly about their own experiences, both in their diaries and their letters home during the war. But when they communicated with each other publicly, in their songs, their journalism, and daily conversations, they invariably put a brave face on their circumstances by employing humour. And while the tone and the frames of reference would have been quite different, humour was just important for junior officers as it was for ordinary soldiers. And Lord Moran writes about this. He, of course, was an officer during the war, but he writes about how important humour was. In fact, what he says is humour was the only thing. It was the only thing that allowed us to make sense of our circumstances. But although humour was a central, I would say, defining characteristic of troop culture during the war, and evidently tells us something about combatant mentalities, historians, with one or two notable exceptions, have had very little to say about it. Those who have suggested that humour was a sort of a coping mechanism. It helped soldiers make sense of this radically novel and terrifying world at the front line. But humour was more than a coping mechanism. The self-deprecating, mock-heroic humour of British soldiers, which is so clearly revealed in their songs and their slang and their trench journalism, acted not only as a coping mechanism, but it served to provide a basic standard of soldierly conduct. The ability to take the violence and deprivation of frontline service in one stride, or at least to appear to do so, represented a standard of everyday courage that soldiers both respected in their comrades and attempted to cultivate in themselves. Now, this soldier's perception or conception of frontline courage is captured, I think, particularly well in the so-called Old Bill cartoons produced by a British officer called Bruce Bairnsfather. It's a portrait of Old Bill here. So Bruce Bairnsfather had served in the army in the pre-war period. He was called up then as a reservist after the war broke out. He served in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and he was there in Flanders from the very earliest days of the war. He served in the southern part of Belgian Flanders, near Plug Street, and had quite an intense experience of frontline service. When he was convalescing back in Britain after being invalided out of the front line in mid-1915, he began creating this series of characters that became referred to as the Old Bill cartoons. Now, this is Old Bill himself. He's very distinctive. He has this kind of walrus moustache. But there's a whole series of characters that are seen as today, and certainly at the time, as highly representative of the ordinary British soldier. Now, these cartoons were very popular with the civilian population. They were published as fragments from France in a magazine called The Bystander, which was a civilian magazine, and in fact was read by a lot of women during the war. So they were appreciated as funny, they were enjoyed by the civilian population. But for soldiers on active service, they took on a very distinct and interesting relevance. They appealed to British soldiers because they seemed much more authentic than the representations of soldiers produced by traditional artists like Richard Caton Woodville or Harry Payne, or indeed the illustrators of the daily press. The average soldier could see a good deal of himself in Old Bill and the other characters. This is one example. Now, some of this is dated a little bit in terms of its humour, but it's a coiffeur in the trenches, and what he's saying is, keep your head still or I'll have your blinking ear off. And of course, The humour is that they're in an intensely violent environment, and he's worrying about nicking the guy's ear when he's cutting his hair. And he's speaking in a Birmingham accent, which I'm not going to subject you to at the moment, but that comes out quite clearly in the vernacular. This is quite a good one. Old Bill isn't in this. Keeping his hand in, Private Smith, the company bomber, formerly Shinio, the popular juggler, frequently causes considerable anxiety to his platoon. And what's interesting about this cartoon is that it also kind of points to the way that the vast majority of British soldiers who served during the war were either wartime volunteers or conscripts. These are men who would not have joined up outside the circumstances of a world war. Okay, so they are men who had civilian professions and trades to which they were much more attached, very often, than their role as soldiers. Now, for soldiers on active service, men who were experiencing life in the trenches, Old Bill and his pals embodied a set of very practical, but nonetheless courageous qualities. They were tough, reliable, stoical, and possessed of the sort of wry humour that could help a man survive army life in general and frontline service in particular. These men were not knights or martyrs, but ordinary soldiers. The average man could identify with their courage and aspire to possess it himself. So Bairnsfather's cartoons, in common with soldiers' songs and trench journalism, both offered and reflected a combatant code of conduct in which courage was closely linked to humour and endurance. As one officer who was serving on the Western Front observed, Old Bill symbolises what the men like to see in others and want to see in themselves. He stands for a frame of mind that works. A fellow like that goes through this hell and comes out on the other side, if he's lucky, sane. That's the test. That's what they want. That kind of spirit is gospel to them. Now, arguably, that kind of spirit in a body of troops is the definition of good morale, and I would say the definition of combatant courage. Now, Lord Moran also commented on Old Bill, and he made the point that Old Bill allowed people, and the sort of humour we see in the Old Bill cartoons, allowed people to make sense of this terrifying environment of the front line. Now, for Lord Moran, in a protracted war of attrition, the ability to stick it and to continue to perform one's duties, despite long-term exposure to enemy fire, was the true mark of courage. For Moran, courage in trench warfare had little to do with martial prowess or chivalry, and more to do with winning the inner struggle with fear in order to endure month after month in and out of the line. This is one of the most striking passages, I think, in his memoir, The Anatomy of Courage. By day or by night, in trenches or in billets, whatever the odds, still there was no such thing as one moment's complete security. So, as the war dragged on, as the wear and tear of trench life told, we came to think less of the gaudy act performed on the spur of the moment, to value more the worth of the man who was prepared to see the thing through. Now, the almost belligerent pride with which ordinary rank-and-file soldiers regarded their own powers of endurance suggests that they shared this view of courage. In the winter of 1916, a British intelligence officer called Martin Hardy carried out a survey of letters of British soldiers of the Third Army. And what he was trying to do was gauge morale. The Somme offensive had taken place. Coming into the winter of 1916, he wanted to see, and the army wanted to see, what is morale like? How is it holding up on the Western Front? And what he discovered was that the authors of the letters that he looked at seemed to describe to the same sticking-it philosophy that permeates the trench journals, the songs, and the cartoons. Complaining was rare. This belligerent, bloody-minded determination to endure, to stick it, that was very common. Now, these are just two examples, but again, they're highly representative. So what these were, by the way, these were green envelope letters. So if you were a good boy and you had good conduct, you were given a green envelope, which meant that your letter wouldn't be censored by an officer in your own unit. It would be censored much further down the line. So the idea with the green envelope is you could be much freer to express yourself. You could reveal personal kind of feelings and emotions that you mightn't reveal in an ordinary letter. one particular soldier, and this is November 1916. And remember, the Third Army had served in the Battle of the Somme offensive, and been quite badly mauled. I'm quite physically fit and completely fed up mentally. But there's nothing to do but stick it and rejoice in the dead certainty that the Hun is getting a damn sight worse than he gives our men. Or, don't talk about the advance stopping to hasten my leave. Let them keep on. It's hell, but we can stick it. And then the last long leave for everyone. Now, what these soldiers seem to be saying to the German enemy is, bring it on. We can take this. We can take whatever the war has to dish out. And because we can take it, we will win. So there's a sense of bloody-mindedness. The worse things get, the more determined we are to stick it and to endure. Now, just to conclude, what I think these sources reveal is that in a protracted war of attrition, in which victory remained elusive, personal agency was reduced, and fear had to be repeatedly confronted, the power to stick it and behave as if all these things really didn't matter formed a key component of frontline courage. So the determination to endure involved a refusal to accept the role of passive victim that trench warfare seemed to push the frontline soldier into. Virtually everything about trench warfare pushed the soldier into the role of passive victim. Barbed wire, machine guns, accurate small arms, and especially artillery, the enormous, awesome power of artillery, that pushed him into the role of a sort of a helpless victim. The definition of courage was rejecting that. I'm not a victim. I have power. I have agency. I have prowess. Now, some historians who concerned with the identity and self-perception of soldiers in the Western Front have commented on the degree to which combatants, soldiers, view themselves as victims. And as I sort of suggested earlier on, I think there's also a persistent popular understanding of the soldiers of the Great War as victims, as men who had no agency, men who didn't really understand the world they lived in. Now, look, there is little doubt that troop morale fluctuated, that individual soldiers felt extremely beleaguered and stressed and victimized and felt like victims at various times. But the ethos or culture of the front line, as revealed in the trench journalism, the songs, the cartoons, etc., emphasized a defiant rejection of victimhood. Humorous mock heroics, and indeed mock defeatism, were an articulate expression of that rejection. The characters in the Bruce Bairnsfather cartoons are a good example of this. These men are often thoroughly beleaguered and fed up, but they are not victims. They are not anonymous, passive, or defeated, and this was clearly a part of their appeal to soldiers on active service. Now, just one final point. These cartoons, trench journalism, when they're referred to, it's often as though they're simply just picturesque little footnotes, picturesque little aspects of the experience of the frontline soldier. But I would argue that they're a lot more than that. They're the key to understanding how the soldiers of the Great War understood their own experiences. And as we go through a period of commemoration, if we're hell-bent on remembering soldiers, but not particularly interested in understanding them, understanding the world they lived and died in, then there isn't a great deal of point to the exercise. Thank you for listening.